As we kind of conclude and wrap up these slides on the Trinity, as we're still kind of processing some of what's really technical material, right, in dealing with a very abstract doctrine, I want to suggest a way of thinking about it that my undergraduate professor suggested to my class when we were dealing with this topic. And he said it's helpful to think about the Trinity in connection with the event of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And if you do that, then you start to see how the Trinity is occurring where Christ died. That doesn't mean it's the first time the Trinity ever existed or came into being. No. We're just thinking about it from that perspective, right? So we see the Trinity. The Trinity is showing up. It's occurring. It's evident to us. The phenomena of the Trinity becomes visible to us, right? Where Christ died. Because that is precisely where the separation between the Father and the Son especially is most apparent. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me, right? And so Jesus dies, and according to some versions of the Apostles' Creed, enters hell, the place where God cannot go. And, there will be controversy around that version of the creed, but let's set that aside. Let's just think about this, that even with the words on Christ's lips, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus dies God-forsaken and descends into hell, the place where God cannot go. So the separation between the Father and the Son is at its most extreme. And it is the Spirit that raises Jesus from the dead, out of that place which is God forsaken, out of that place where God cannot go, except God in the Holy Spirit goes there and embraces the forsaken Son in the love of the Father. And so what we find is that that separation between the Father and the Son does not put a halt to the divine unity. In fact, that unity becomes the events in which that which is absolutely separate from God is embraced by God. And the Spirit, this transcendent mystery, becomes the reaching out in love of the Father to the Son. The Son who is a history, like we are a history. But the Son is a history without beginning or end, in which a teenager gets pregnant, has a son who is tortured and killed dead and raised from the dead. And yet even then he remains the dead one, the crucified Christ, even though he is also the living one. These contradictions are important for theology. Here, this implies that death and sin are raised and somehow even sanctified. It takes some reflection to understand what's going on there. So we don't have a Holy Father without this dead man bound together with the Spirit. In this world where you and I live, where the world we inhabit, there is God-forsakenness. And it is to this world that the Father goes by sending the Son and the Spirit. And so we cannot understand one member of the Trinity without understanding the other two. The dynamic language here that I'm using is characteristic of the early church father Irenaeus. So we can use the Christ event, the death and resurrection of Jesus, to start to theologically, kind of explore the perspectives on the Trinity. But why be concerned with this doctrine? Why does the doctrine matter? What is the real value of the doctrine of the Trinity? Does it have any value for us, or is it more confusing than it's worth? I think that's the question, the real question that confronts us today. Are any of the doctrines of Christianity more confusing and more trouble than they're worth? And isn't this the worst, quote unquote, doctrine of them all in terms of, the abstractness of it? Does it have any real significance for us? So as we strive to move past what often tends to be a focus on the math, right? 3 and 1, 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1. How does that happen? As we strive to move past some of the metaphysics and the Western commitment to philosophical monism, when we start to move past those sorts of things that are ways we've tended to focus on the Trinity in the past, the doctrine of the Trinity has the potential, I think, to really re-energize, to inspirate, if you will, right? To re-energize, to inspire, to guide our Christian spirituality, our Christian faith, our churches. In part, we're seeing a way of understanding community here, right? In our time, community is a voluntary association of like-minded individuals, right? So it's something we choose, and we gather together with those who are already like us, those who think like we do, right? The tensions that we have with people who vote differently, who have different values, who think differently about things that matter to us, who look differently, who smell differently, right? We have tension with that. We have difficulty with that. And as we start to look at this doctrine anew, while the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, they share the same divinity, they do so in such a way that none of the three are impoverished. So while there are distinctions among the Trinitarian persons, there is also equality. And this is the nature of God's life and love. If it starts with diversity rather than unity, and the unity emerges through the relations and the love of the diverse persons of the Trinity, that gives us hope that our communities also could start to look like the Trinity. Do we even dare to imagine that our communities could look like the triune life of God? Well, I think that's exactly the boldness of Jesus' prayer in John 17, where our love would be so complete, our unity would be so complete that we would become one with them, with the Son and the Father, right? Even as we're one together, Jesus prays. How do we find that kind of unity in diversity that allows us to have community without being allergic to that which is different, right? How do we do that? We find that in the outgoing, self-giving, agapic love of the Trinitarian persons. We find it that as the heart of the Trinity is turned outwards in self-giving love to the other persons, and then ultimately in the incarnation to the world, right? That the center of the human self, who we are, our personal identities, are pushed more and more out there. And is that how we might understand sanctification out of the Wesleyan holiness tradition today? So this thought is always on my mind. The doctrine of sanctification used to bring people into our churches. It used to energize and excite us. It was a meaningful doctrine for us, and it is no longer. It is not any longer a meaningful doctrine to us. Not for any lack of commitment or effort on our parts, but because the way the doctrine has been articulated no longer connects people with God. So I am mindful of time on this video, but I think it's important to say this. I had a professor once who said, if you keep saying the same thing over and over, after a while you're no longer saying the same thing, because meaning is contextual. The meaning of words, the meaning of statements and ideas changes over time. So if you keep saying the same thing, after a while you're no longer saying the same thing. If holiness is about our perfection and love, then we can't find that in here. We can't be sanctified in here in ourselves. We can only be sanctified in our relations to one another. And that's what we see in the doctrine of the Trinity. The person, you and me as persons, just as we talk about the persons of the divine persons, the triune persons, so also you and me as persons, we are not fundamentally a private, discrete, individual substance. That's the way we used to think about the Trinity, and that's the way the Trinity doesn't make sense to us when we start there. Instead, there is no longer a self at the center of our world. We are no longer the owners of our own properties. But everything has become a gift to us, just as the triune persons gift one another face. And so by affirm the personhood of the other, even in their unity, so everything for us is a gift. So I'm going to close with this. If theology is the question of the relationship between God and creation, what does our reflection on the Trinitarian nature of God suggest about how that question might be answered? If theology is a question about the relationship between God and creation, how does our reflection on the Trinitarian nature of God suggest that we might answer that question?